There's a piece of wood sitting in the Arizona desert right now that has been harder than most modern concrete for over 200 million years. Nobody treated it with epoxy. Nobody coated it with industrial resin. The desert did it. And the people who lived in those harsh, sun-scorched landscapes thousands of years ago were paying very close attention. Here is the problem with the chemical resins we use today. Modern epoxy works beautifully inside a controlled workshop, but drag it out into a desert environment where surface temperatures can exceed 160 degrees Fahrenheit, where UV radiation hammers everything relentlessly, and where the humidity swings violently between wet and bone-dry, and those polymer chains start breaking down. The wood underneath begins to breathe again, expanding and contracting while the epoxy coating cracks and peels. The protection fails. Ancient desert cultures understood this long before any chemistry lab existed, and they solved it from the inside out, not the outside in. The journey to rediscover this method starts in the scrubland, not the romantic kind of desert you see in films, the real thing, thorny, brittle, achingly dry. This is where specific shrubs have spent thousands of years producing resins so dense with mineral content that when they seep from the bark and bake under direct sun for months or years, they don't just dry, they calcify. They become something closer to a mineral deposit than a plant secretion. You find these hardened amber-colored masses clinging to the branches of plants like creosote and certain varieties of desert acacia. They look like rough stones. They ring like pebbles when you tap them, and that is exactly the point. Getting that stone-hard sap into a usable liquid state without destroying what makes it powerful is where the real craft lies. Open flame is the enemy here. Direct heat burns off the volatile terpenes and destroys the delicate mineral suspension that gives this resin its extraordinary properties. Ancient craftsmen understood this intuitively. The solution was always controlled, indirect heat. By concentrating reflected sunlight onto a sealed stone or clay vessel, you can bring the interior temperature up gradually, hovering around 180 to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. At that range, the calcified resin begins to slowly liquefy, releasing itself in thick, honey-dark flows without burning. What you are left with is a viscous compound that is genuinely unlike anything a modern synthetic lab produces. Suspended within that liquid are silica particles, calcium compounds, and complex organic acids that have spent years absorbing minerals directly from arid desert soil. This is not just a sealant, it is a mineral delivery system. The filtering process matters enormously. Desert dust, plant debris, and sand particles contaminate the raw extracted liquid. Ancient craftsmen used tightly woven plant fiber as a sieve, pouring the warm resin through multiple layers until only the clean, dense mineral compound remained. What sits in the vessel at the end is something extraordinary, a dark, syrupy liquid that smells faintly of wood smoke and earth, and which begins hardening into a glassy skin the moment it makes contact with cooler air. Wood is not solid. Under a microscope, timber looks more like a city of hollow tubes, stacked end to end. These are the lumen cells, the channels that once carried water and nutrients through the living tree. In untreated wood, these channels are open and empty. That is what makes wood vulnerable. Moisture gets in, bacteria follows, rot begins. The goal of pressure infusion is to fill every single one of those cellular highways with the mineral resin before any of those enemies can take hold. Preparing the wood correctly is, well, absolutely critical. The timber needs to be thoroughly dried first, because if there's any moisture left inside, it'll just block the penetration of the resin. Historically, this meant actually burying wood in dry desert sand for weeks, letting the arid environment slowly pull the moisture out through osmosis. Once the wood is genuinely dry, the grain opens up, You can almost feel it when you press your thumbnail into the surface. It's thirsty. The infusion itself uses a sealed pressure vessel. When you immerse the timber in warm liquid resin and then apply pressure, the resin has nowhere to go but inward. It's forced through the grain into the medullary rays, into the lumen cells, all the way to the deepest structural levels of the timber. The physical change is almost immediate. You can see the color shift moving through the wood like a slow tide, the fibers darkening as they fill from the inside. The timber feels heavier in your hands within just a few hours, and it even sounds different when you knock on it. It rings. The infusion is really only the beginning. Once the timber is saturated, it needs exposure to intense UV radiation to trigger the final stage of calcification. In desert conditions, this is actually quite simple. You just leave it out under direct sun. The UV light acts as a catalyst, triggering cross-linking reactions between the organic acids in the resin and the mineral compounds, creating an interlocked crystalline matrix within the wood fibers themselves. The weight increase in treated samples compared to untreated controls is dramatic. Timber that started at a certain density can gain 30 to 40% of its original mass as the mineral compound solidifies throughout the grain. When you run a diamond-tipped drill against the treated surface, the resistance is remarkable. It behaves less like wood and more like compressed sandstone. The surface resists scratching. It resists impact. It resists moisture. The grain has effectively been replaced cell by cell with a mineral organic composite. Trying to carve the petrified surface with a standard woodworking blade is a lesson in humility. The tool slides, the timber refuses. It is genuinely difficult to make an impression without specialized equipment, which is precisely what ancient craftsmen were counting on. What makes this profoundly relevant in 2026 is the environmental cost of synthetic resins. The toxic solvents, the petroleum derivatives, the carbon footprint of industrial production. The desert method produces zero synthetic waste. It is entirely renewable, entirely biodegradable in process, and the resulting material outperforms many modern treatments in extreme environments. The desert did not just preserve wood, it perfected it. Long before chemistry caught up, arid climates were running their own laboratory, teaching anyone patient enough to watch and learn. This ancient knowledge is not primitive, it is elegant, and the fact that we almost lost it entirely should make every one of us ask what else we have forgotten in our rush to modernize. If this took you somewhere new today, hit that like button and share this with someone who still believes old knowledge is dead knowledge. Subscribe to The Survival Historian, because history is not a museum. It is the most practical survival manual ever written.